Greetings, men of 222. It's great to be with you today. You know, I love to wear this shirt. I love this cross on this shirt, and it's terrific to go to war today, get into action with a cross on my shirt to remind me of who I represent. So today's topic is action, which simply means to do something. But the essence of action is not to be passive, not to be lazy, not to be idle. And much like unwavering, we need to know when to act and when not to act. We are God's instruments for His plan. It is the Lord who gives us direction. And as Isaiah 10 and 15 points out, we are the axe, but God wields the axe. In Psalm 46:10, some of you might be saying, well, it says, cease striving and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. But once we know that He is God, we need to be about His business, just as Jesus was in the garden. Remember when He said, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Although the prospects were beyond human imagination, Jesus acted. He completed His assignment. So many men won't act because they aren't sure of every detail, the possibilities of what their actions might be. That's just poor leadership. As Teddy Roosevelt once said, the only man who never makes a mistake is the man who never does anything. Men, we must not be crippled, causing paralysis by analysis and realizing that God don't move no parked cars. We need to be going. We need to be in action for the Lord to use us. The great theologian Will Ferrell, that's tongue-in-cheek, that's the anchor man, Will Ferrell, said this. He said, my fear of failure never approached in magnitude my fear of what if. What if I never tried at all? How many of us are in bondage to what if? What if I never tried at all? Our motto should be ready, aim, fire, and if need be, re-aim. But so many guys that I know, their motto is ready, aim, re-aim, 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 re-aim. You know, it's just silly. They never do anything. Sometimes we just have to make the best decision we can, and with the facts that we have, and then we're to act, even if it's against all odds. You remember the story of Todd Beamer? He had 2 sons, and his wife was pregnant with a third. And the television broke the news about the plane crash in rural Pennsylvania. And at first it was reported that the crashed plane was headed for Chicago, but this was later amended to San Francisco. Lisa Beamer said, Todd's husband, or wife, I'm sorry, at the time I knew it was Todd's flight. I sensed no hope for survival. You see, Todd was on Flight 93 on September 11th of 2001. Lisa Jefferson, a flight counselor for United Airlines, called Lisa Beamer a few days later after 9/11 and told Lisa how in a calm voice and business-like voice, Todd told her the details. There are 3 hijackers, 2 of them have knives, there are 10 passengers in first class, 27 in coach, there are 5 flight attendants, and the passengers were discussing ways to overpower the hijackers, ways to act. It's what we have to do, Todd had said at the time. Jefferson told Lisa that Todd had called and talked about his family, and he asked her to call his wife if he didn't make it home. He said, I don't think we're going to get out of this thing. I'm going to have to go out on faith. You see, Todd Beamer was an ordinary man with extraordinary courage, with others on Flight 93, knowing the only chance that they had to survive was to act. Todd said over the phone, Jesus, help me. Are you guys ready? Let's roll. A phrase he often used with his boys. Lisa Beamer made this observation. She said, Todd lived every day trying to make little decisions that were in line with the big goals he had for his life. You see, Todd Beamer was intentional. He was making little decisions that were in line with the big goals that he had for his life. So the actions that he took on September 11th were just one more example of the way he lived his life. Obviously, these were some of the hardest and most courageous decisions that he made, but he was able to make them because he was practicing every day before September 11th. When I first heard that story, I was talking about it with a friend of mine, Mark Steyer, who's at Westerville Christian Church, and he pointed out to me that at one time he had been Todd Beamer's youth minister in Wheaton, Illinois, and that he said that is the character that that young man has had all the way along. Could they say that of us were that to occur? The Bible is replete with stories of men of action. Ehud in Judges 3, Peter, who got out of the boat in Matthew, men like Caleb, men like the three Israelites, and even Gideon. We think of those guys, but sometimes we get a misimpression of John the Apostle. Sometimes John the Apostle is painted as a withdrawn fellow who was reserved. And yet, listen to this story told by Polycarp, who was a disciple of John the Baptist. He wrote some stuff about him, and he said this: according to the tradition of Polycarp, the Apostle John once went into a bathhouse to wash. But when he knew that Cerinthus was within, he leapt out of the place and fled from the door. For he did not endure to be even under the same roof with him. He didn't even want to be under the same roof with him. And he enjoined those who were with him to do the same, saying this: let us flee, lest the bathhouse fall in, for Cerinthus, the enemy of truth, is within. Do we turn off the TV when there are pictures on there that we shouldn't see, or our children shouldn't see, or frankly our wife shouldn't say? Do we turn those off? What if we walk into a place, even if it's a family gathering, and it is absolutely awful? Do we act? Do we make some adjustment to what's going on? The Apostle John did. He actually portrayed flee immorality with flesh. True man of godly action. Now, I've chosen to look at the life of Samson as it relates to action, even though, frankly, he's a very flawed fellow. Honestly, Samson's life is more a commentary on God's grace than it is on Samson's goodness. But remember, I had an assistant coach once who said, nobody's worthless. They can always be used as a bad example, and such is Samson. Samson was a man of action all his life, but it was most often driven by selfishness and lust, not by integrity or godliness. In fact, Samson's first act of selfishness and frankly lust was in his choice of a wife. He disobeyed all the rules. She was a Philistine, not an Israelite. They were unequally yoked. He told his parents to get her for him because she looked good. She looked good. He was motivated by lust, not love. Then he ate from the lion's carcass, which violated his Nazirite vow. There were three things to a Nazirite vow. A Nazirite never let a razor come on his head. They were to abstain from wine and alcohol, and they were to avoid contact with anything dead, like the lion. Well, after his wife told her relatives the riddle that Samson had given them, he went out and killed 30 Philistines just to repay the debt, because it was some clothes he had to give them. Then Samson was mad at his wife, so her father gave her to Samson's companion, thinking Samson didn't like her anymore, right? Then Samson lost his temper. He burned their fields, though the Philistines burned his wife and her father. Oh man, tough times. But Samson didn't learn his lesson, and he had the affair with Delilah, also not an Israelite, also for all the wrong reasons, men. All the wrong reasons. His lack of discipline and lust caused him to stumble again and again and again. And when Delilah betrayed Samson, he was captured and his eyes were gouged out. He was forced to push the grinding apparatus in the prison. But as time went on, his hair grew back, and the Philistines called him for a party for their god Dagon and made fun of Samson. That was part of the entertainment. Samson finally saw when he couldn't see, and he asked a young boy to help him find the pillars of the house. There were 3,000 people on the roof and more under the roof. And finally Samson prayed, "O Lord God, please remember me and strengthen me just this time, O God, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Even here his motivation was selfish. It was for him. As he pushed on the pillars, he asked the Lord, "Let me die with the Philistines." He killed more that day than in his whole 20-year career as a judge for Israel. But what can we learn from Samson? Real biblical action requires forethought, integrity, and intent to honor Jesus. Say that again. Biblical action requires forethought, integrity, and an intent to honor Jesus. Samson was only concerned about Samson. I know that if you act, I understand this, if you put yourself on the line, you will be criticized, ridiculed, and made fun of when you fail. But Teddy Roosevelt had it right when he said this: "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, who's making the effort right now with his family, who's trying to be the man that God called him to be." He didn't say that, I did. So he said, the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, and who, at the best, knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. We don't want to be those guys. Remember when Wallace said, "All men die, but not all men live." We want to be the ones that live. So takeaways this week: the essence of action is to not be passive, to not be lazy or idle. Number 2, God will let us run our lives without him if we insist on it, a la Samson. Lack of integrity and godliness leads to ruin. Action for the sake of action is meaningless. It's like a tire spinning stuck in the snow in the winter that gets nothing accomplished because it just sits there and spins. Action for the sake of action is meaningless. And lastly, God can still use us for his glory, even if we're knuckleheads. I love that. God can still use us for his glory, even if we're knuckleheads. Isn't that great? Hey, be intentional this week. Honor Jesus because he's alive. See you next Saturday, Lord willing, and the creeks don't rise.